Town police officer Juan de la Cruz not guilty for the shooting death.
Officers will not be spending any time behind bars for shooting an unarmed man.
Jury in Pennsylvania found a police officer not guilty of murder. She had shot an unarmed man in the back.
Tonight, a police officer acquitted on all charges in the shooting death of a black man after a traffic stop.
Ever wondered why is it so goddamn hard to convict a cop for killing somebody? Welcome to How to Get Away with Murder, Cops Edition. Today, we'll be covering all the ways in which cops evade accountability when they've killed someone. We'll cover cops, prosecutors, juries, the Supreme Court, and everybody's favorite thing, qualified immunity. First things first though, this is my first transition into long form content, so if you enjoy learning about these types of issues, please go ahead and subscribe and send to anybody you think might enjoy learning about these types of issues too. A lot. In 2024, the police shot and killed actually the record number of people we've seen in 1 year. 1,251 people were shot and killed by law enforcement in 2024. To be clear, I'm talking about people that the police have shot and killed while they are on duty and in uniform. I am not talking about the people that police kill in their personal lives, like their girlfriends or their wives. Spoiler alert though, that number is pretty high too. In 2023, the police shot and killed 1,164 people. In the last decade, the number of civilians killed by law enforcement has hovered around 1,000 people per year. Sometimes it's a little less, sometimes it's a little more, but we have seen that it is increasing. Black people are 3 times more likely to be shot and killed by law enforcement than their white counterparts, despite being 1.3 times more likely to be unarmed. The Black community makes up 30% of these shootings, despite being 13% of the American population. And the majority of these shootings are happening when there is no crime alleged, at mental health checks and traffic stops and other non-violent disturbances. Some of the names of those killed by law enforcement in 2024 include Ali Kunbert, Maria Pike, Jesse Martinez, Ryan Gaynor, Ezekiel Jackson, and Jordan Parisian. If you'd like to take a look at the names of those killed by law enforcement in 2024, and several other years in the last decade, I highly recommend going to mappingpoliceviolence.org. Less than 2% of police officers who have shot and killed someone will ever face any charges such as murder, manslaughter, or any other crimes related to that shooting. 98.1% of police officers will never face any type of charges related to taking someone's life on duty. 10 officers were charged with a crime in 2023 related to these fatal police shootings. 12 were charged in 2022. In 2021, we actually saw the record number of police officers ever charged with murder or manslaughter related to fatal police shootings. It was 21. However, that year, 1,148 people were killed by law enforcement. So if you do the quick math on that, it's still less than 2%. It's the record number, and it's still less than 2%. Just to be thorough, in 2020, 16 officers were charged. In 2019, 12. In 2018, 10. And in 2017, 7 were charged with a crime related to taking someone's life on duty. To be clear, we are talking charges here. We are not talking convictions. This is just the number of officers ever charged with a crime related to killing someone on duty. The number of convictions is comically low, like a handful. By 2021, only 7 police officers had ever been convicted of murder for killing someone on duty. I'm filming this at the beginning of 2025, and I was unable to find an exact number to add to that group of 7 in the last few years. However, from my reading, maybe it's 9, 10 now, definitely no more than 12. To take a step back for a second, somewhere around 20,000 people have died because they were shot and killed by law enforcement in the last 20 years. We can get that number again because the number of civilians shot and killed by law enforcement has hovered around 1,000 for many years now. 20,000 people dead, and only maybe 10 police officers have ever been convicted for their murders. Now you might be wondering, that sounds fucking ridiculous. Why on earth is that allowed to happen? Well, might I introduce you to a cop's best friend? No, it's not a dog. It's a fucking prosecutor. In the legal system, prosecutors and police officers generally work hand in hand to convict people of crimes. Prosecutors heavily rely on police officers to give testimony, serve as witnesses, and provide evidence when they are trying to convict someone of a crime. Because of this, police officers and prosecutors are heavily entrenched together. And most of this is entirely self-serving on the side of prosecutors. They are trying to keep their conviction rates as high as possible. That means having really happy, good relationships with police officers so that those cops continue to testify in their cases. I cannot tell you how many times I have seen the headline, "Prosecutor declines to press charges against cop in fatal police shooting," or "Prosecutor declines to press charges against cop who is accused of raping someone." But for the sake of this discussion, let's say a prosecutor does decide to press charges against a cop. Well, who are the witnesses involved? If the civilian is dead and they were alone, then the only other witnesses there are cops. Shocking to probably absolutely no one, cops don't really want to testify against other cops. Cops will straight up refuse to testify in cases that involve fatal police shootings, and even lie on the stand. The thin blue line is such an incredibly insular community that will go to truly any lengths to protect each other. But alright, okay, this prosecutor has no witnesses willing to cooperate, but there's gotta be some evidence, right, from the shooting. Well, areas where police shooting has happened are very rarely treated as crime scenes. Police officers, when they have shot someone, do not treat that area as though a crime has occurred. Therefore, a lot of evidence regularly gets destroyed or is simply not taken. That means that there is usually very little physical evidence to use in these cases against police officers. So we have no cooperative witnesses, very, very little physical evidence. What about the juries? First, I want to mention that most police officers want to go to a jury trial. So many officers are incredibly confident that they will get off not guilty or acquitted if they go to a jury trial, as opposed to taking a plea deal. And they have good reason to be confident because juries regularly do find cops not guilty or acquit them. Juries still have an incredibly hard time believing that a police officer did something wrong in a moment that is often described as split second and their best judgment. And I do think that there are a lot of racial and socioeconomic implications as to how juries are selected for these cases. But incredibly often we're finding juries are finding officers not guilty or they are deadlocked, which leads to a mistrial. In the jury's defense, they are given incredibly confusing and convoluted guidelines as to how to apply the law for police officers. And that leads me to the Supreme Court. Two Supreme Court cases from the 1980s lay the framework for the level of protection that the legal system affords police officers. I'm going to be reading a little bit from my notes just so I get the language correct. In 1985, Tennessee v. Gardner ruled that an officer can use deadly force against a fleeing subject if they believe they are in danger of death or serious physical harm. This was after the police shot and killed a 15-year-old Edward Garner. In 1989, the Supreme Court ruled that officers who use force must be ruled on the standard of, quote, objective reasonableness. After the police beat DeThorne Graham, a diabetic man trying to find orange juice to treat his sugar decline. And if you're wondering, like, what the fuck does any of that even mean? You're not alone. These decisions are meant to be somehow both arbitrary and convoluted as possible, to give law enforcement the most capacity to find their behavior lawful under these standards. Not to mention, fear of injury is subjective. What makes you scared might be different than what makes me scared. How is something so subjective meant to be the standard for legally killing someone? There is also no standard definition as to what should be considered reasonable. Instead, the legal system asks a group of jurors who are often particularly chosen because they don't have any real distinct understanding of the law to apply confusing and generic legal doctrine to cases involving police officers. Without any real guidance as to what should be considered, quote, reasonable, juries are often deadlocked and conflicted, which means that cops get acquitted or mistrials left and right. Recent Supreme Court cases have doubled down on this mindset too. Casella v. Hughes, City of Tahlequah v. Bond, Lombardo versus City of St. Louis, and Baxter versus Bracey, just to name a few. As I'm filming this video now, there's actually another court case that is planned for oral arguments in front of the Supreme Court on January 22nd. Barnes v. Felix centers on Ashton Barnes, who was killed by law enforcement in 2016 during a minor traffic infraction stop. The question at the center of the case is whether or not the use of deadly force should be judged at the, quote, moment of threat or under a broader totality of circumstances approach. In layman's, should cops be able to argue, well, in that one exact moment, I was really scared, so it's not my fault? Or should the totality of the situation be considered, like when it's very obvious that the civilian didn't really pose any real threat at all? Listen, I'm not a Supreme Court expert, nor am I an attorney. I'm actually a social worker who has a very funny way of using her free time. So I'm gonna move on from what the Supreme Court has to say, but if you have any more insight into these court cases, please comment below. So we've established just how hard it is to charge and convict a police officer for murder. So what are the options for a family whose loved one has been killed by law enforcement? Well, they could try suing that officer in civil court. And that's how we get qualified immunity. For those of you that don't know, qualified immunity is a legal doctrine that protects police officers from being sued by people in civil court. Qualified immunity does not apply in criminal court. In the most general of terms, qualified immunity states that a police officer cannot be sued in civil court unless the person suing them can prove two things. One, that the behavior that the police officer exhibited was in fact unlawful. And two, that a police officer in the past has been successfully convicted for the exact same thing that you are accusing this officer of. To sue a police officer in civil court, you have to have precedent, which means you have to go find a case where a police officer was successfully sued in civil court, and the details of that case have to be identical to yours. And I mean identical. There have been cases where people have sued police officers in civil court for excessive uses of force, and they will go and find a case that is truly as identical as anyone will be able to find. But because in one case the civilian was lying down and in the other case the civilian was sitting up slightly, it will get thrown out because it wasn't identical enough. And because they so often get thrown out due to qualified immunity, no one is able to establish precedents because no one is able to successfully sue without precedents before them. So that means if you are the family of a loved one who has been shot and killed by the police, you often can't get murder charges and often can't get any damages in civil court. That's why many states are considering ending qualified immunity, including Colorado in 2020. I'm gonna wrap this video up here. I hope you learned something in this video, and if you did, I hope you sent it to somebody that you hope learned something too. If there are any parts of this video you wish I went into more detail on, please let me know in the comments below, and I'd be happy to make additional content on those topics. I am very passionate about policing and gender-based violence work, so if you have any topics you'd like me to cover, please leave them in the comments below. I also love researching these types of things, so don't worry if you think I don't already know what it is. I am happy to read more. Thanks everybody, and remember, all cats are beautiful.